From the moment she could remember, Emily had always felt like a shadow in her own family. Her older brother, James, was the golden child, the son who could do no wrong. Their parents, Margaret and Richard, had poured every ounce of their energy and resources into his success, leaving Emily to fend for herself. She didn't resent him, at least not in the beginning. As a child, she had idolized her brother, watching him effortlessly glide through life with their parents' unwavering support. But everything changed the day their parents made a decision that would alter the course of Emily's life forever. It was a summer evening when Margaret and Richard gathered their children in the living room. Emily, then in her early 20s and fresh out of university, was cautiously optimistic about her future. She had dreams of starting her own business, of carving out a space for herself in the world. James, on the other hand, had already encountered failure after failure in his ventures. Yet their parents seemed blind to his shortcomings, always ready to pick up the pieces. "We've made a decision," Richard began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that made Emily's stomach tighten. "We've decided to give James the money we've saved over the years. He's found a new opportunity, and we believe this could be his big break." Emily's breath caught. The money? All of it? She looked at her mother, hoping for some sign of hesitation, but Margaret's expression was one of quiet resolve. There was no room for negotiation, no space for Emily's dreams in their plans. "And what about me?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. Margaret sighed, as if the question itself was a burden. "Emily, you're strong. You've always been independent. You'll find your way just like you always have. But James needs this." The words hit her like a blow. Independent, strong. They were euphemisms for being ignored, for being left to handle life's challenges alone, while James was coddled and rescued. Emily's protests went unheard, her parents' decision as unyielding as stone. That night, James left with their life savings in his pocket, and Emily was left with nothing but the sting of betrayal. Years passed. Emily worked tirelessly, taking on odd jobs and long hours to support herself. She climbed slowly, painstakingly, toward her goals. Each step forward felt like a rebellion against the narrative her parents had written for her. While James's ventures continued to falter, Emily's determination only grew stronger. She started her business from scratch, pouring her heart into every detail. The journey was grueling, but with time, it bore fruit. Her small enterprise blossomed into a thriving company, earning her a level of success she had never dared to dream of. Her parents, meanwhile, remained firmly entrenched in their loyalty to James. Each time one of his ventures failed, they would bail him out, selling assets, taking out loans, and sacrificing what little comfort they had left. Emily watched from a distance, her heart a complicated tangle of bitterness and pity. They had made their choice, and she had learned to live without their support. But life has a way of circling back, of forcing unresolved matters to the surface. One rainy autumn evening, Emily received an unexpected call from Margaret. Her mother's voice was shaky, laced with the vulnerability Emily had never heard before. "Emily, can we talk? Your father and we need your help." The request was simple but heavy with implication. James's latest venture had left their parents in financial ruin. The savings they had once lavished on him were gone, and the loans they had taken out on his behalf were now crushing them under their weight. They had no one else to turn to. Emily sat in silence, the phone pressed to her ear, as the years of neglect and pain bubbled to the surface. Her mind raced with memories of their dismissal, their disregard for her needs, their unwavering favoritism. And now, after all this time, they were asking for her help. She agreed to meet them, though not out of obligation. She needed to face them, to remind them of the choices they had made and the consequences those choices had wrought. The meeting was set for the following weekend, and Emily spent the days leading up to it grappling with a storm of emotions. When the day arrived, Emily walked into the small cafe where they had agreed to meet. Her parents sat at a corner table, their faces etched with worry and weariness. They looked smaller than she remembered, their confident demeanor replaced by something fragile and uncertain. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup, and Margaret's eyes darted nervously to the door as Emily approached. She sat down across from them, her posture straight, her expression calm. They exchanged pleasantries, the conversation stilted and awkward. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "Emily," he began, his voice faltering, "we know we've made mistakes. We know we've hurt you. But we're in trouble now, and we don't know where else to turn." Emily listened, her face unreadable, as they explained the depth of their financial struggles. When they finished, silence settled over the table. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on them, and took a deep breath. This was her moment. Not to seek revenge, but to remind them of the choices they had made and the lessons they had yet to learn. Emily folded her hands on the table, her gaze steady as she looked at her parents. The weight of their request hung heavily in the air, pressing down on all three of them. She could see the desperation in their eyes, a vulnerability she had never witnessed before. But her own pain and years of neglect simmered just beneath the surface, and she wasn't ready to let them off so easily. "Do you remember the night you told me about your decision to give all the savings to James?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "You said I was strong, independent, that I'd find my way. Did you ever stop to think about what that meant for me? Did you ever wonder what it felt like to be told, as your daughter, that I wasn't worth your investment?" Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. The silence stretched, and Emily let it linger. She had spent years swallowing her pain, pretending it didn't matter, but now it was time for them to hear it. "You made your choice," Emily continued, her tone unwavering. "You chose to pour everything into James, to bail him out time and time again. And when he failed, you took on more debt, sold what you had left, all for him. You didn't just neglect me. You dismissed me. And now you're here, asking for my help." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but Emily held her ground. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," she said, softening slightly. "I'm saying it because you need to understand. Your actions have consequences, and those choices have shaped all of our lives." Richard finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We know, Emily. We've been blind to so much. We thought we were doing the right thing, helping James, giving him the chance to succeed. We didn't realize how much we were taking from you." Emily leaned back in her chair, letting his words sink in. She believed him, at least she believed that they hadn't intended to hurt her. But intentions didn't erase the years of struggle, the nights spent wondering why she wasn't enough. "I understand that you thought you were helping him," Emily said, "but you need to understand what that meant for me. I had to fight for every step forward with no safety net, no one to catch me if I fell. And I made it. I built a life for myself without your support. But now you're asking me to step in and fix the damage James has caused. The same James you sacrificed everything for." Margaret's tears spilled over, and she reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it on Emily's. "We're sorry, Emily," she said, her voice cracking. "We're so sorry. We see now how unfair we were to you, and we have no right to ask, but we're asking anyway. Please, if there's anything you can do to help us, we'll never forget it." For a long moment, Emily said nothing. Her heart ached, torn between the desire to protect herself and the lingering sense of obligation to her parents. She thought of all the times she had picked herself up, of the strength she had built through years of hardship. And she thought of them, sitting here now, stripped of their pride and begging for her help. "I'll help you," Emily said finally, her voice steady but laced with resolve. "But this isn't just about money. If I'm going to step in, things need to change. No more rescuing James. No more enabling his failures. You need to take responsibility for your actions and rebuild your lives. Starting now." Margaret and Richard nodded quickly, their relief palpable. But Emily wasn't finished. "I'll help you get out of this mess," she said. "But I won't let you drag me into the same cycle. This is the last time. After this, you're on your own." Her parents agreed, their gratitude spilling out in broken sentences. Emily listened, but she remained guarded. She had spent too long being overlooked, too long bearing the weight of their choices. She would help them now, but she would not let herself be pulled back into their orbit. As she left the cafe, Emily felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief, and a sliver of hope. The wounds her parents had inflicted wouldn't heal overnight, and their relationship would never be the same. But this was a step, however small, toward reclaiming some semblance of balance. For the first time, Emily felt like she had taken control of the narrative, reminding her parents that she was no longer the forgotten daughter they could overlook. And as she walked into the cool evening air, she resolved to continue building the life she had fought so hard for, on her own terms, with her own strength. Helping her parents wasn't an easy process, and Emily knew it wouldn't be. The debts they had accrued on James's behalf were staggering: a labyrinth of loans, unpaid bills, and financial obligations that seemed impossible to untangle. Emily spent countless nights poring over the details, contacting creditors, and negotiating repayment plans. Her business acumen, honed through years of struggle, became their saving grace. Despite the work, Emily remained guarded. She set firm boundaries, refusing to let her parents drag her into the emotional chaos that had defined their relationship for so many years. She was helping them because she chose to, not because she owed them anything. That distinction was crucial, and it gave her the strength to stay in control. The turning point came when Emily decided to confront James directly. Her parents had avoided involving him, either out of shame or a misguided desire to protect him. But Emily knew the cycle wouldn't break unless James faced the consequences of his actions. She arranged to meet him at a small diner on the outskirts of the city, far from the polished offices and high-rise apartments that symbolized the life he'd tried and failed to build. When James arrived, he looked disheveled, his once confident demeanor replaced by something hollow and uncertain. He sat across from her, avoiding her gaze as she ordered coffee for them both. "I'm not here to sugarcoat anything," Emily began, her tone firm. "You've left our parents in financial ruin. They've sacrificed everything for you, and now they have nothing left. Do you even realize what you've done?" James's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Emily thought he might deny it, deflect the blame as he had so many times before. But instead, he sighed deeply, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I know," he said quietly. "I've messed up. I never wanted things to get this bad." Emily wasn't moved by his regret. Words wouldn't fix the damage he had caused. "Regret doesn't mean anything if you don't take responsibility," she said. "I'm stepping in to help Mom and Dad. But this is your mess. You need to face it." James nodded slowly, his gaze finally meeting hers. "What do you want me to do?" "Start by owning up to it," Emily said. "Our parents aren't your safety net anymore. You need to find a way to contribute, to help them get out of the hole you've put them in. And you need to stop expecting everyone else to fix your life." The conversation was tense, but for the first time, Emily saw a glimmer of understanding in her brother's eyes. Whether or not he would follow through remained to be seen, but at least the words had been spoken. As they parted ways, Emily felt a small sense of closure. She had done what she could. The rest was up to him. Back at home, her parents were slowly beginning to adjust to their new reality. Richard had found part-time work to supplement their income, and Margaret had started selling handmade crafts online, an idea Emily had suggested. They still had a long way to go, but Emily could see the spark of determination in them, a recognition that they could no longer rely on James to provide the future they had hoped for. One evening, as Emily was organizing paperwork in her study, Margaret knocked softly on the door. She entered hesitantly, holding a small, weathered box in her hands. "This is for you," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "It's not much, but it's something I should have given you a long time ago." Emily opened the box and found a delicate gold necklace, the pendant engraved with her initials. She remembered seeing it once as a child, tucked away in her mother's drawer. Margaret had promised it would be hers one day, but Emily had forgotten about it over the years. "I kept it for you," Margaret continued, tears welling in her eyes. I thought I'd give it to you when you needed it most. And I know it doesn't make up for everything, but I hope you'll accept it as a start." Emily's throat tightened as she held the necklace in her hands. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of her mother's remorse. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. In the weeks that followed, Emily began to see subtle changes in her parents. They were more mindful, more willing to listen and acknowledge her contributions. The wounds of the past hadn't healed completely, but there was a sense of progress, of moving forward together. For Emily, the journey was far from over. Her relationship with her family would always be complicated, shaped by years of favoritism and neglect. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for her parents, but for herself. She had fought for her place in the world, and now, she was reclaiming her place in the family that had once overlooked her. As she stood in her office, the necklace resting against her collarbone, Emily resolved to keep building the life she had created. A life defined not by her parents' choices, but by her own resilience and strength. Months passed, and Emily's life continued to evolve. She balanced her work, her own personal growth, and the tenuous relationship with her parents. While she had stepped in to help them get back on their feet, she remained cautious, ensuring that she didn't lose herself in the process. The boundaries she had set were firm, and for the most part, her parents respected them. Her father, Richard, took to his new part-time job with quiet determination. Though it was far removed from the comfortable lifestyle he had once enjoyed, he found a sense of purpose in contributing again. Margaret's craft business grew slowly but steadily, giving her a sense of pride that Emily hadn't seen in her mother before. For the first time, Emily saw her parents taking responsibility for their own lives, rather than pinning all their hopes on James. As for James, he had largely faded into the background. After their confrontation, he had made vague promises to change, but his actions proved fleeting. He drifted from one odd job to another, avoiding the deeper reckoning Emily had hoped for. Though her parents occasionally expressed concern for him, they no longer seemed inclined to enable his behavior. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. One autumn afternoon, Emily received an invitation to her parents' home for dinner. It was the first time in years that they had extended such an invitation without ulterior motives. Curious but wary, she accepted. When she arrived, she was greeted by the smell of her favorite childhood meal, roast chicken with rosemary and garlic, and the sight of her parents bustling around the kitchen. It was a scene she hadn't experienced since she was a teenager, and it filled her with a bittersweet sense of nostalgia. Over dinner, the conversation was light and surprisingly easy. They spoke about Margaret's latest craft projects, Richard's stories from work, and even shared a few laughs. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt a glimmer of what family was supposed to be. But as the evening wore on, the conversation took a more serious turn. "Emily," Richard began, setting down his fork and looking at her with uncharacteristic earnestness. "Your mother and I have been talking, and we want to tell you something." Margaret nodded, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "We know we can never undo the mistakes we made," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But we want you to know how proud we are of you. Everything you've accomplished, you did on your own. You're stronger than we ever gave you credit for, and we're sorry it took us so long to see that." Emily's chest tightened. She had waited years to hear those words, but now that they were here, they felt almost surreal. She glanced at her father, whose expression was one of quiet sincerity. "We've made some changes," Richard added. "We sold the last piece of property we owned, the one we were holding on to for James. We've used the money to pay off the rest of our debts and start a small savings fund. It's not much, but it's ours, and we're going to take care of it this time." Emily nodded slowly, processing their words. It was a step, a significant one, but she still felt the weight of years of neglect. "Thank you for telling me," she said carefully. "It means a lot to hear you say that." Margaret reached across the table and took Emily's hand. "We've also been thinking about the future," she said. "We want to make sure you know how much you mean to us. We were updating our will. Whatever we have left, it'll be split evenly between you and James. It's not much, but it's what's fair." Emily's first instinct was to protest. The wounds of their favoritism were still raw, and the idea of sharing anything with James felt unjust. But as she looked into her parents' eyes, she saw their sincerity. This wasn't about erasing the past. It was about trying to make amends, however imperfectly. "Thank you," Emily said softly. "I appreciate that you're trying to make things right." The evening ended on a hopeful note. As Emily drove home, she reflected on how far they had come. Her parents had taken responsibility for their actions, however late, and while the scars of the past would never fully fade, there was a sense of progress. She wasn't ready to forgive entirely, but she was willing to try. In the weeks that followed, Emily's relationship with her parents continued to improve. They called her more often, not to ask for help, but simply to check in and share their lives. They visited her office, marveling at the business she had built from the ground up. For the first time, they seemed to truly see her, not as a second priority, but as their daughter, someone to be valued and respected. As winter settled in, Emily found herself feeling lighter. The burdens of the past still lingered, but they no longer defined her. She had carved out a life for herself through resilience and determination, and now, she was cautiously allowing her parents back into it. Their relationship would never be perfect, but it didn't have to be. It only had to be real. Years later, Emily found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her and her parents to a fragile but genuine peace. The anger and resentment that had once defined her feelings toward them had softened into something more complicated, a mixture of guarded affection and cautious hope. Their relationship was far from perfect, but it was no longer fractured beyond repair. One crisp spring morning, Emily received an invitation from her parents. They had decided to host a small family gathering at their home to celebrate Richard's 70th birthday. The thought of attending such an event filled Emily with mixed emotions. Family gatherings had once been a source of pain, moments where she was reminded of her secondary status to James. But this time, things felt different. Her parents had spent the last few years making genuine efforts to include her, to value her as an equal part of the family. And so, with some trepidation, she accepted the invitation. The day of the celebration arrived, and Emily pulled up to the modest house her parents had downsized to. It was a far cry from the large home of her childhood, but it felt more honest, more reflective of who they had become. She carried a carefully chosen gift for Richard, a vintage book on gardening, one of his few passions in retirement. As she approached the door, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever the day might bring. Inside, the house was warm and bustling with quiet laughter and conversation. Margaret greeted her at the door with a genuine smile, pulling her into a hug that felt surprisingly natural. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice soft with emotion. Emily stepped inside, scanning the room. James was there, standing by the window with a drink in hand. He looked older, wearier, but when he caught her eye, he gave her a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She had long since stopped expecting an apology from him. What mattered now was that he seemed to understand, in his own way, the impact of his actions. The celebration unfolded smoothly. Richard beamed as he opened Emily's gift, his gratitude evident in the way he traced his fingers over the book's worn cover. "You always know exactly what to get," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Emily smiled, feeling a flicker of pride that she had managed to make him happy, even after everything. As the evening wore on, Margaret called for everyone's attention. She stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped together nervously. "I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here today," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "And I especially want to thank Emily." The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward Emily. She froze, unprepared for the spotlight. "There was a time," Margaret continued, "when Richard and I didn't see what was right in front of us. We didn't appreciate Emily the way we should have. We made mistakes, so many mistakes, but she never gave up on us, even when we didn't deserve it. And because of her strength, our family is still together today." Emily's throat tightened as her mother's words sank in. She glanced around the room, seeing the emotions mirrored in the faces of those present. Even James looked affected. His expression softened with something resembling remorse. "Emily," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "You are the heart of this family, and we are so proud of you." For a moment, Emily didn't know how to respond. The room blurred slightly as tears welled in her eyes. She had spent so many years yearning for acknowledgement, for validation, and now that it was here, she wasn't sure how to accept it. Finally, she stood, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more to me than you know." The rest of the evening passed in a haze of warmth and reconciliation. Emily found herself laughing with James, reminiscing about childhood memories that no longer felt tainted by resentment. Her parents' home, once a place of pain, now felt like a space where healing could continue to grow. As Emily drove home that night, she reflected on how far they had all come. The wounds of the past hadn't disappeared, but they had been acknowledged and tended to with care. Her parents had finally seen her for who she was, not as an afterthought, but as a person with her own worth and strength. Emily knew the future wouldn't be perfect. There would still be moments of tension, scars that would ache on occasion. But she also knew she had reclaimed her place in her family, not by forcing it, but by staying true to herself. She had built a life defined by resilience, and now, she was building a family defined by understanding. As the lights of the city blurred past her car window, Emily smiled. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A chance to write a new chapter, one where love and respect could finally take root and flourish.